Hello and welcome to the News Club podcast, where we talk about the news and, more importantly, what to do about it. The Rebel Citizens we've invited today are Dan Edelstein, one of the artists, filmmakers and organisers behind Power Station, along with co-producer Leonie Rosham. So, from my understanding, Power Station began in East London as an art activism project of neighbours coming together to put solar panels on rooftops and generate their own power. At the same time, Hilary and Dan, the directors, have been documenting the journey, creating a film that shows how everyday people can take back control of their lives and one of life's most basic needs, energy. And today in particular, I'm really curious to ask around the how. So, how you've done this, how others can follow in your footsteps, and how momentum can grow behind projects like these. Because I find that we don't often get to see what community autonomy really looks like, or can look like, or can begin to look like. And with much, many other grassroots organizing, as was also expressed in the film, it emerges from the absence of state support, of the need for us to, again, take that back into our hands and really show what's possible when people step up and take charge themselves. So, in a couple of sentences, who are the creators behind Power Station? I'll pass on to you, Dan.
Okay, so the question is, who am I? And Hilary and Leonie. So I'm going to go through that in order. So I'm Dan. I'm a filmmaker, and I've been making films for like longer than I should admit. Like I guess since like the year 2000. So 25 years of filmmaking. And I guess like for me, I got kind of. At first, I used to make films like about activists, or certainly some of them were. You know, there was a series that we did for Channel 4 in 2005 called Subverting the City, where we looked at different activists who were in some ways intervening within the kind of power structure and dynamic of, the contemporary capitalist city of London, So, and they were kind of artists, activists, and, I found that really fascinating. But it not enough, it didn't satisfy me enough, like to be sort of to take that role of the outside documentarian. I prefer, like, I was tempted, and I had a feeling of wanting to like become, to use film as a way of activating things in the world, so to almost like to ignite movements and not just to propel them effectively. So that was me. And then Hilary, her background was artist, and again, like, very politically engaged, site-specific art. And, we met in like the year 2000, something like that. And we're a couple, I should say. And so we were sort of exploring. At first, I used to document her work quite a lot. So she sort of, it was like she got this kind of documentarian, for free that came along with the relationship, and so I used to like, just film all the stuff that she would do. And then gradually we sort of began to, I suppose, and then I'd go off and make films, etc., separately. Then we started to sort of collaborate on films. Then bit by bit, we began to see that we could actually somehow blend the two things together, the filmmaking, the art, and the activism bit by bit. And I suppose like the first iteration of that really made sense was the bank job that we did before Power Station, where we took over an old bank, printed money, and then sold the money, as artworks, and used the proceeds to buy up and blow up £1 million of debt. That was a film that came out, I guess, in 2020, I think, and immediately preceded the Power Station, where we took some of those ideas around money creation into the world of, green renewable technology, which is that's kind of effectively the themes that we're exploring in Power Station. And Leonie, because you asked me who are the people behind it, and Leonie, I'm going to mansplain who Leonie is, and then
And then she can correct you.
or Leonie, would you prefer to just Leonie
No,
explain?
you go ahead. I don't want to.
Okay, so Leonie joined us, I think, just at the end of Bank Job. In fact, I know for sure it was, because the first time I met Leonie was during a kind of awards ceremony where we were trying to get an award for Bank Job, and we were shortlisted for the most entertaining documentary award at the Grierson Awards. And Leonie came across, like, I don't know, I was walking along the thing, a floor or whatever. Along the floor? Yeah, I was just walking. And then Leonie said, she popped over and said, really like your film, Bank Job. And I was like, have you seen that? How did you see it? Because it's almost impossible to have seen that film, because it came out during lockdown. So only the only people who saw it were like live streaming it. It didn't go into any cinemas, which is what you always hope for at the end of these documentaries. But she said she really liked it, and that she was kind of a new documentary, new to the world of documentaries, and wanted to gain, or I'm not sure if she said, I'm new to the documentary world and I want to gain some experience, but I've picked that up anyway. So then, and we were looking for people to work with us on this next project. So I said, well, why don't you come and join us and do some work? She was pretty busy at that moment, so she couldn't really do much. But so it was a few months later when she started to work with us, but has been working on Power Station with us pretty much all the way through, I think, and 2 or 3 days a week with us, and has now become the impact producer on the project, which means that she has taken charge of getting the film out there into the world and how it can have an impact on communities and become this kind of method of activating activating action. I think I probably need
It
more coffee.
absolutely has exactly that power to activate action. I think I couldn't say it better myself.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure that Shakespeare would approve of the phrase, but I can live with the fact that I occasionally come out with phrases that make no sense. So that was me just sort of, let's say, Dan-splaining Leone, but I just want to say what an amazing force of creativity and loyal and amazing filmmaker, producer Leone is. So thank you, Leone.
What wonderful words to hear about you, Leone. Anything that he's missed out?
No, yeah, I think thanks. Yeah, Dan. I always really loved Bank Job because of the way art and happenings or spectacles are kind of used to spark imagination, but also on the ground to understand really complex kind of theories and like how the economy works and how debt works. And I was a big fan of David Graeber, but it was really like through Bank Job that I understood kind of creditocracy, and it was really tangible. And I think, I just hadn't seen that being done by other people. Like Dan and Hilary really have created this kind of show and do method of working, and that really, really excited me.
Couldn't agree more, yeah. It's somewhat referenced in the Power Station film, and I remember thinking to myself exactly that of, oh, like this is an entry point to coming to understand something that's actually quite complicated and that is often seen as like abstract and away from you, but it's actually super relevant. And I think I can say the same about Power Station. I teared up. I teared up by the end of the film. Like it was really gorgeous. It was really gorgeous. It brought me a lot of joy. And also I'm really like this art activism aspect of it as well. I do way too much thinking. And as part of that thinking, I keep thinking about how to do things, and not just how to do them, but the fact that I need to like have the intrinsic motivation to do it, and then the extrinsic support that then makes me keep going, because now other people are like related to this work, and now I'm doing it not just for myself, but for whoever has been part of the project or whoever is supported in whatever shape and form. And it's what gives it. But also the need to like relate it to art, to relate it to something that is literally done for its own sake, where like means and ends are being met, I think super important, super important. So anyways, that's what's in my mind. And now I want to come to a question that I ask everyone on this second series. And that is, what should be headline news but isn't? And from a story to an idea to something that you wish you could shout at the world, basically, what would you put in the headlines?
Stop murdering everyone in Gaza. That's the main headline that I carry with me at almost every moment, or the feeling that I carry. Everything else feels subsidiary to that at the moment, even fighting the climate crisis. But weirdly, it's conflicting for me because we've got a feature film coming out, economics again and around green energy, and obviously we really need to promote that, and yet it's hard to concentrate on the thing that we've spent 5 years making, because we're living still in a time where the mainstream opinion, or at least the kind of political classes and most of the media, carry on reporting on Gaza as if it was some kind of balanced war zone where one side has got military objectives which are valid, whereas actually that's just far from the case, and it's just like so I think soul destroying for all of us to witness what's happening, and to have to somehow live in a world where these toxic fictions are peddled as if they're somehow the voices of authority or respectable opinion. So yeah, it's a topsy-turvy, awful situation, and deeply depressing, really. Although, like, I don't want to be the depressing, angry voice in the world, so there's that as well. But yeah, that's what's on my mind, and has been for for way too long. This is just shouldn't be happening. So yeah, sorry about that. But yeah, that's how
No,
I.
I mean you're certainly not the first person to say that. I think there's never been something more relevant. There's never been something that, and not just in the headlines, but the kind of stories that we put in the headlines, the kind of humanity that is lacking from those headlines. I don't know. I see you nodding, Leonie.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same and think really similarly. Like stories are so and headlines and what we tell ourselves are so important. Like we're very much a story species, and it's like I feel like the headlines often are ones that are like accelerating a notion of violence actually rather than reflecting how people feel. And like most people really do not support this genocide in Gaza. And if we were telling stories about what we actually wanted and visions of like what a kind of less isolated, more connected sort of way of relating to each other, I think we would, it would be a very different kind of narrative. But it feels like legacy media kind of really drives off this divisive, polarizing sort of way of reflecting like what's happening in the world.
I would really love to bring you in as well, Debs. I feel like I didn't properly introduce you this morning. That's awful. Debs is with us. Hello, Debs.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, I guess when you're asking this question of what should be headline news, the structure of the headline is like, oh, this is what we should all be paying attention to today. And it plays into this way that news is structured, which is like a series of unrelated bullet points that don't actually cohere into a narrative of that you can actually make sense of. And I think one of the things I really appreciated about the film was also you kind of showing how difficult it can be to take action on a particular thing, and you're like, okay, we've decided we're going to try and do this thing, but then I mean you were doing it at the start in the middle of like the worst of the pandemic, and that also was like this constant, you can see it's this constant thing of like how can we be spending our time thinking about this thing when this other thing is happening, and yet also it shows the difficulties of keeping and maintaining focus and concentrating on a goal and bringing people together in a coherent way. But it also shows the kind of peaks and troughs of it. And so, obviously the film coming out during like an intense famine period of a genocide is not something that anybody would want or that you could possibly anticipate. But the film coming out in the context of some mad shit happening in the world, that was pretty much guaranteed, right? Like there were always going to be these other things that were going to make it feel like, well, on some level, what is the point of this? And yet I do think that the film has, like it, amongst many other things, it tells a really beautiful story about London and a part of London and a way that people are being together in London that you almost never see. You never see that kind of mix of people living alongside each other, having these relationships, seeing like both addressing the struggle that it is to live there and to live in this country, and also some sense of like collectivity and being together. So I, for one, think it is still important to be going out, promoting the film, doing the work, and also acknowledging that there's all of the other things that are going to be pulling your attention away.
And ultimately, like it's part of the same systems of violence as well. And that's what's emerging, from our energy crisis, I guess, to speak to a particularity in terms of what the film is somewhat concerned with. But on that, what does your work tell us about the world? And I know this is a big question, but if someone listening wanted to start their own power station where they live, where would they go? What should they do?
That's a good question. It's such a concrete, easy one. So thank you for that final one. I'll do that one first. So, like setting up a local power station, there's a DIY guide on our website, power.film. You can download that. I think there's a free, it's all free anyway. You can, without even putting your email in, you can get one of them. And if you want to get a slightly deeper one, you need to put your email in. We're about to start off Zoom calls at least once a month on, street by street power stationing. And that will be run by a sort of like a collaborator of ours. Well, it might be, I might be on the Zoom calls as well, but Howard will probably be doing that. He's an installer who comes out of the cooperative movement and really gets it and wants to just do streets, street by street effectively. We're collaborating hopefully with them. We're just trying to get an agreement with them sorted, but that should be coming along pretty soon. And then the next question about like, well, I think I'd like to go back. Actually, there were 2 points I think that I'd like to make. Following both of what you've all been talking about. One of which is like how to keep focus or how to set off on any project during a moment where the world seems to be basically imploding and the toxicity and the kind of violence is just erupting in everyone's face, and it's really hard to like think of anything other than that. There's a book, I can't remember who it's by, but I think it's called The War on Art, and it's all about, it's written by, I think, like a former Marine or something like that, someone pretty intense. But it's about like how, when you set off to do anything, you're going to find that there's like a million different reasons to stop, no matter what it is that you want to do, and how to keep focus. And, how we get pulled in so many directions all the time, and how nonetheless one has to just acknowledge all of that, but to keep moving forwards, on a specific trajectory. And just, that we will, it's like, I can't remember what the word for it is, but it's just like, just this kind of like pressure, internal pressure that just comes from everything, and that, the easiest thing to do is just to allow it to take over, and to sort of, and just to say, oh no, it's not the right time to do this. And it's not the right time to do that. And, so I've somehow seen that for myself, in life, and just try to just launch imperfectly into stuff and then just keep at it, and just to celebrate small wins and just to keep moving through. And so I think that's, it wasn't a good time to come out. Like for Bank Job, it wasn't a good time to come out during the pandemic. We couldn't go to cinemas properly, but we just thought, we've just got to get this film out, so we just got it out. It wasn't a good time to start Power Station, because we were locked in our house and it wasn't really what we'd imagined. It's not a good time for Power Station to come into the world. We've just launched a crowdfunder. It's not a good time for that because, we had a bond issue months ago. Nothing's right. Nothing works, and everything's a pain, and I think that's what life is. It's just this, like that's a quite Buddhist way of looking at things. But I think the question isn't what can I do that isn't painful or problematic. The question is, what problematic thing should I do? What painful thing should I do? What pain do I want to be in? And then choose that pain, because nothing will be easy. And so like read The War of Art or The War on Art or whatever. It's a useful book for helping distill some of these issues, and then to be able to then sort of realize that these obstacles and difficulties will never get out of your way, but it's the choice that you're faced with is how are you going to deal with those and what are you going to do, so that's my take on that slightly deeper question.
Yeah, it's funny, Debs, when you were talking about how the headlines are not a coherent narrative, it's like bullet points. And then Dan, you saying like there's never been a good time for a film release. It was reminding me of the edit of Power Station, and when we were having to go back and we'd filmed like 3 years worth, or 5 years actually, 5 years worth of footage. And it was like, okay, how do we structure this into something that tells a story that people can follow? Because it was like filming every day, filming every week. And the basic structure of it was how can a story be told on one street? And like that's one of the limitations of it, or like the restriction is that it is just one street. But then as we then tried to chronologically kind of go back and build the story, it was like a timelining these news reports and like what things would have come through the radio and what moments were happening kind of culturally and politically that were anchoring these things that were then being felt on the street collectively, and we were picking up in our filming. And there were so many moments. There was like a big moment that's actually in the film, oddly, but it's quite an interesting moment, is like the Queen dying, the King coming to the street, how that actually brings a lot of people together, even though most don't support the monarchy or in any way, but there are a lot. And it kind of just basically shows how a street responds to the news, how it's kind of, we're part of the world as it changes and the problems that arise, and that's always going to be part of the story, but we are organizing with ourselves locally, kind of despite that / because of that. And it is a really important part of the context, as opposed to something that we wish wasn't happening. We are always responding to this world that we're currently in, and that those become the anchor points of the narrative in a way. Yeah.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed being reminded almost as well as like a viewer that this is what was happening in parallel to, because, you know, as audience, we also were listening to you. We were also going through this lockdown, you know what I mean? Even if you're living in a completely different city, country, wherever that is. A big question that I had in my head as I was watching as well was the financial model that I'm assuming has emerged from the film prior to that around debt. Did that inspire the decision to then print those notes and create a new currency? Or was it a new idea? And also, I'm actually really curious to know about the different funding models that facilitate, because money is such a massive part of making this happen.
Yeah, that's a good one as well. Like the design of the story was like inspired by Anne Pettifor's book, which is called The Case for the Green New Deal. And that book argues that for a Green Deal to actually happen, what that means is a huge investment in green infrastructure, and on a scale not seen in terms of like a government investment, not seen since Roosevelt unleashed this massive stimulus in, you know, Depression era America. So the argument for that wave of investment was originally written by Keynes, you know, the economist. So we were looking at that economic theory and arguing that obviously this is the opposite from austerity. It's also, you know, that we knew from bank job that most new money that's coming into our economy is obviously created by private banks and used, you know, to actually lend to people who already have, you know, property. It's sort of, I think 60% of new money that's lent, so money is created when it's like loaned, is for mortgages. Like something like 60% of it is for that. But really, you know, most of the kind of green infrastructure projects that need funding are just seen as not sexy enough by banks to lend money to them. So because they get neglected, and there's not enough money in that, we just end up with the same system of like fossil capitalism, you know, and like massive debt on personal balance sheets for most people are in debt. So we wanted to argue, you know, through the storyline of the film that, you know, we need this new form of money, you know, so and it needs to be going into the creation of green infrastructure like solar and wind, etc. So we created something that we called the greenback, which was inspired by Abraham Lincoln, you know, because when he was fighting in the Civil War in America, he decided that in order to kind of like to pursue that war, he didn't want to be borrowing from like Wall Street, you know, because Wall Street, the private banks on Wall Street, if they were to fund his war efforts, they would be getting rich off of war, you know, as usual. And so he decided to create a type of money that was backed by the people, by the taxpayers, and that was called the greenback. So we thought, well, we'll kind of take that title of greenback and subvert it and use it for money which can actually underpin a kind of green revolution. So that's why we brought back a currency, a kind of form of currency or art currency, and we called it that greenback. And then we would sell it, and then we'd use the proceeds to fuel the project and to build local wealth and to put solar panels on the street. That was our original concept. And then, you know, as is so often the case in these types of projects, where, you know, or as is the case in life, in fact, and most stories, is that, you know, we set out to try and do the minimum possible thing to achieve the goal, you know. So for us, we set up the greenbacks and we hoped we'd sell £1 million of greenbacks. We'd turn the street into a renewable power station. The film would end, you know, the end of story. That would be it. But the problem was that, you know, we just didn't sell enough greenbacks. So we were selling enough kind of thing connected to our membership, but just like nowhere near enough to be able to fuel the project like we needed to. Interestingly, the difficulty with funding that we were experiencing was like a microcosm of the difficulty of funding that the entire green movement is experiencing. You know, and something like, I think there was a statistic that we learned recently, which is that like something like 2% of all philanthropic funding goes into, you know, the green movement, you know, if you like. So it's just like a massively important problem that we're facing collectively, which is just hugely underfunded. And most of the philanthropic funding or funders that there are busy talking about what they should spend their money on, and they're spending their money on asking consultants what they should spend their money on. And that is like, that sounds like I'm being bitter, but literally, like, the amount of emails and correspondence I've had from funders telling us that we've caught them at the wrong moment because they're just thinking about what they should spend their money on at the moment and not actually spending their money on it. So it is just completely absurd, what's going on with the funding in this situation. So we've ended up like having to just like devise methods of funding ourselves as we've gone along, which have actually worked for us. And like a lot of that has been in learning how to do direct marketing and build an audience ourselves without innovating in how we fund our filmmaking and also renewable energy deployment activities. We would have got literally nowhere at all. So we've built like a big mailing list, and we've crowdfunded. I think altogether we've crowdfunded over 400,000 on this project, and we've got it won't be a surprise to learn that we've got a crowdfunding live now to help pay for the distribution phase, because every single funder that we thought would come aboard at this point, where we have demand from over 100 cinemas, every single funder has just like turned us down. Film funders, etc. We have had some funding from foundations, etc., for our kind of core funding, which is great, but it's just really patched together. And I think that the way that we've patched funding together is just like it's a symptom of the bigger problem, which is that there's just not enough funding in this movement. And, there's a lot of talk, but what we're interested in is action, and action always costs more than talk.
The reason I asked that question also is because income generation, money generation, and sustainability for these projects is so vital, not just like the legal structures, but the financial models that keep us afloat. And I'm asking because also I think it's always really interesting to ask for effective projects that have succeeded in one way, shape, or form, and that have had to actually change throughout that process and react to not having enough funding, to the, as you say, the microcosm of the lack of funding, which we're definitely experiencing, and that I see across different movements.
I was thinking that it's important to say that, what gets funded gets done, and what gets non-funded basically dies on the street. We could deliver a scaled up version of Power Station on every street and make it socially inclusive and economically inclusive in every place around Britain, because Power Station is a vision of what we would do if we were a government, as just a couple of artists or a trio of artists, if you like. But the whole point of it is to say this is what we would do, but it's absurd that we even have to do that. The people are being bypassed by all the systems of power. And actually, when you explore what their needs are and what the primary interests of the people are, and then you ask the question, why is this not happening? Well, the reason it's not happening is because this democracy, or so-called democracy, is not acting in the interests of the people. It's extractive, violent, and set up to maintain the power of the few over the many. The main overarching money for storytelling in this world we're inhabiting in Britain 2025 is going to reflect like those power dynamics. So it's no real surprise to me, in a way, that we've struggled to raise the funding. But it's also completely imperative to understand, like, this is why we've had to build systems which can go directly to audiences and can speak to those audiences, maintain relationships with them, and to bring in money from those audiences, almost like a micro version of, taxation in a way. We have a membership, and it's our job as filmmakers, artists, thinkers, etc., to create space for ourselves to exist in a world which really doesn't want us to exist. And Leonie was saying earlier on, the old media or something. What was that phrase that you had, Leonie? What's it called?
Legacy media.
Legacy media. I love that, because that legacy media, it sounds like this kind of like old computer that's just gathering dust in the corner or something, and that like is barely compatible with the new operating system of the world. And yet, like, it's still got the majority of the money and the majority of the power, this legacy, old, outmoded system, we're all born with kind of human rights. And I feel like artists should also claim power for themselves. We need to exist. We need money to exist. We need money to do projects, etc. But you have to grab that space, that oxygen, in spite of the fact that there are these very vicious attitudes out there which say continually now that if you're not funded by Channel 4 or Sky or Netflix, that you don't have a valid project. And you have to really fight against that. It's a psychological thing, it's in your head, and it's a philosophical thing. So it's really important to be able to develop a strong thought process above all else.
I think there's also something there about, at the beginning of the film, there's a little mention of energy commons, which doesn't get picked up again later, but I was interested because people are trying to say, okay, well, you're saving this money, and then where does that saving go? And does it just sit at the household level, or is there a way of pooling that as a street? But I think there's also something there about what you're trying to do with creating the power station on a street is you're trying to remove some of your basic needs from the market. And so you're saying, artists need money to live, but you need money because things cost money, because you've got to pay your rent and you've got to pay your energy bills and you've got to pay for food and stuff. And then actually, if you're reducing the amount of cash that you need, the amount that you need to participate in that formal economy by having some of the infrastructure actually but then I think the way that that's talked about, this kind of autonomy so often being seen at the household level, the family level, and so it's really great to see it happening on this street level. You can conceptualize it. For the first time in my life, I live on a street where I actually think we possibly could do that. It is a really friendly, collectivized, cooperative street. You can see how you can share the risks, you can share the rewards, and all of the other benefits that would come from, like in the film as well. It's about power. That's both the electricity that you need to power your lights, but it's also the sense that you have of being a group and being able to take care of each other and look after each other. Yeah, so there's just something there about, it is about money, but it's partly about trying to access the money to release yourself from needing the money.
Absolutely. That's why I wanted to ask about the solar energy itself that's being generated. What has been the success of that on your street so far? Do you know how much money you've been able to save? Again, where that money can go to? Has that been a kind of recent relevant conversation?
Yeah, these are great questions. And also, I'm really glad, Debs, that you picked up on when I try and explain power, I always say, we were looking at trying to build an energy commons, because obviously that is different from houses saving themselves money as a single unit. And actually, a lot of the ideas that we had were what happens if we dig up the park and try and build a street heat network, or we'll have a communal battery, which means the school at the end of the road and all the houses can share the energy, and then we can distribute it between each other. That also means that, because a limitation within the film is also that it's only on homes that are owned by the people who live in those houses. And we really didn't want that restriction, but it was really, really hard to work with the council to get homes owned by the council to have solar. So there are so many things that we want to do differently and are still trying to do. And the whole project is this trial and error. In that same vein, the idea that it is power in both ways. It's how a community has power, but also generates power. We still, in terms of the solar and knowing, we're working with Nesta to try and get an analysis on the street to see how much has been saved, individually. But when we've been thinking about this and how to kind of explain the impact, I think one of the aspects of it is also the social benefit of what having a power station, a renewable power station on the street is, and the fact that we've all learned how to work together. And that has meant that the community itself is so much more resilient. And the living room in Dan and Hillary's house effectively became the town hall where these conversations were had. And it's constantly with people coming in and out. And there's been spin-off events that have happened, like growing 10,000 sunflowers in the street, and that being a big spectacle and happening where people are coming together. And it's all about also trying to kind of rehearse this thing that we want to build that exists beyond just some houses having solar on their roof. And so we don't yet have like all of the statistics of how much energy has been saved and individual amounts of saving, but we're sort of starting to frame it as like it's also the film acts as like a personal testimonies as to why building power for a street in this way has so many different impacts that we can't quantify just in like energy in that and like individual house savings. Like it's so much more beyond that, and it's like a commons. How do you share that space in the negotiation? And yeah,
it's about our bread and our roses, and those are the roses, and obviously that's not just mentioned in the film, but something that I think has been recurring for a really long time in terms of what we see as really integral to making it possible. Again, our activism making it possible, being it like that's what makes it powerful. Again, going back to this notion of power, is that you're able to see this, you're able to see, and also I quite admire the amount of effort that was put into connecting yourselves with everyone that was needed to make it possible. Not just like your membership and like sponsorship support, but the actual school itself that is involved. The Christmas number one, again, like you said, the sunflowers, like all these different moments, the different community groups, be that for providing food and or like the kind of local, what was it, like the plots of land that people are growing things on, right? Like that's like so much effort is put into actively being connected to the people that are able to then sustain this project. And I think that for me really came through in watching the film. Really, really gorgeous watching the film.
Yeah, and I thought that moment when there's a kind of trough and you're feeling low, and then you go round to these different groups and you're like, what is it that keeps you going, or what is it that gives you hope, or and I think there's something so important about, you're trying to lead on something, and then at some points being like, I need you to lead me. Or like the people from the food project who are like, how do you keep going? They're just like, with the whip. And it's so like obviously the opposite of how they actually do things, and it's funny and it's sweet. I remember this moment I saw Angela Davis speak at the South Bank Centre, and in the Q&A, Marcia Rigg, who's the sister of Sean Rigg, who died in police custody, who's a founder member of United Friends and Family campaign, like an amazing campaigner around some kind of state violence. And she asked the final question, and she was like, how do you keep going when things are so hard? And Angela Davis turns to her and says, I take inspiration from people like you. I take inspiration from the work that you're doing. And then the whole of the South Bank Centre, like everyone was clapping and shouting, and Marcia came up on the stage, and it was like this moment of, it was like passing on this energy, being like, you can, there will be these moments of like sadness and depression, and these times when it feels really, really difficult, and then there'll be someone else who at that moment has the energy to like pull you back up. And that was a beautiful thing to see in the film as well.
Thank you for sharing that, Debs.
Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, I can
Yeah.
definitely relate to that. It is painful. It's painful to do these projects, and you do forget that, I think, or sometimes you forget it. Sometimes you forget everything else. You forget that there's good parts, as well. But I think you have to keep that optimism alive in you to act, because otherwise, what would be the cost of just pessimism? Rob Hopkins came on a podcast or a kind of Zoom call with us recently, and I said to him, how does he keep being so positive, relentlessly? And he said, I just don't want to give all of these like toxic, horrible, violent powers the gift of my despondency. And I thought that was really good as well. Keeping going and keeping that fight in you. That's what the kind of oppressive, violent powers, they want to snuff that out. So it's nice to actually to think that you're keeping it going just because you don't want to give them that gift. I think that was a lovely quote from Rob. So yeah,
Absolutely. And what's next then? Like, where's that fight going for you guys? Is there a potential for this energy commons? What's the main struggle that you're encountering?
yeah, I think we're like trying to work out what's next. We are about to release the film, and it's going to come into some cinemas in October. And then it's going to have a digital release. And we've already had a lot of requests, but mainly it's also going to be community-based screenings. And we're really keen for this film to be like an active way of organising. So like you organise a community screening, all the neighbours come together, watch it, and then there's a facilitated discussion after. And we've developed a screening guide, and as Dan mentioned, a DIY guide, which then talks you through all of the ways that this could take place on your street and then change based on the particularities of where you're organising. Like it doesn't necessarily have to be solar, it could be wind, etc. And I think kind of seeing it as like an open source sort of method that then can be adapted and shifted and changed. And so that's one element that is really exciting. And as this grows, we're sharing everything on our website so you can see the different screenings that are taking place and how it spreads. We are starting to develop, or we have just done kind of a prototype of the next project, which is a continuation of Power Station in a lot of the ideas, thinking more about sunflowers, which still have this relationship to the sun, like an ancient technology and storytelling, kind of asking the question, what does a world after oil look like? And looking at processes of phytoremediation as a method of urban mining and decontaminating soil, particularly around like petrol stations. But then that brings up a lot of other questions and ideas. Hillary's been customizing a 90s recovery van and turning it into a soil rescue kind of vehicle where we're in boiler suits and it's got a Ghostbusters / Twister-esque aesthetic, and we're kind of liberating these privately owned spaces that have been holding petrol stations and relics of fossil capital. So yeah, that's kind of where the next idea is going. But there's also lots of other ideas, like Dan has also been thinking about a lot of different avenues, and Dan's also just written a book about crowdfunding and this direct kind of financing. So yeah, there's a lot happening in Power Station, and we're sort of just working out how to also build our own capacity to do that.
To build up and to build out. Dan, any few words, because I do have a few last questions before we wrap up.
Oh yeah, what's next? I don't fully know, to be completely honest. I'm interested in writing and doing some fiction films, so there's a bit of that. And then but I really love this process of like gathering fragments of reality together as well. Documentary, and the way this is beginning to kind of bring in lots and lots of communities and giving hope, hopefully, to people, in a really dark time. That's important. And I think like we haven't changed our view on, like our take on, the kind of where the struggle's at. I think it's just wanting to also explore, keep things fresh as well. Because like there's a very kind of like a strong relationship between Vodka Empire, which was our first film, which you can see on Netflix or Disney Plus now as well, interestingly. There's a strong relationship between that bank job and then Power Station, that the three of them sort of have a similar narrative structure, where we're actually in the film and doing something, and the thing that we're doing exists outside of the film and people can relate to it, and do, take a part in it in some way. But yeah, I think the release, you can't really underestimate like how much time and energy and money a release needs. So trying to like do that with my full heart in it this time, and not miss that trick of how much that takes and not minimize it. So there's over, I think Dartmouth have said that there's demand from over 100 cinemas to show the film, and that's not just once, but actually to put the film on multiple. But most of those places are going to need a Q&A. Right now we don't have the budget to even go, like for one of us to even attend that, in terms of just the costs of that. So, but we will, and so we have to raise that money, get around the country, do Q&As, speak to people, try and make the impact be as much as it can, and not just skirt over, how much work and time that's going to take. I think that's really what's next. And then, these other projects which are beginning to germinate are great, and we can keep developing those and, writing things on trains and things like that. But yeah, that's as far as I've got anyway. I'm still like really like we need to raise a large amount of money just to get this film properly out there. So I'm kind of keeping on that.
And best of luck to you in that process. I really hope that there's a screening near where I am. All right. Well, this is one of the last questions I ask everyone. And that is, what would you bring to the online news club? So this could be anything from certain sources, publications, to topics, creators, movements, physical objects, snacks. What would you bring? For context, on the 20th of September, we are going to be hosting a News Club Live, which takes our kind of news club format of wanting to get people into a room to talk about things and then what to do about those things. So yeah, what would you guys bring? Leonie?
Yeah, to be honest, I feel like any kind of gathering or anything needs really good snacks and food. So I would bring a really good meal to the online news club so that there was something also that was grounding the conversation. And then I have another thing, but
What's the other thing? I want to know.
I've been really interested in this idea of London Community Video Archive has documentation of this bus that was run by this group called Interaction, which created news from the bus, and it travelled to different kind of communities and stuff. And I've been really trying to work out how we can get that bus going again and starting to speak to the people who made that bus to get it going. And I think I would try and bring this bus and think about what's the technologies that we have to suit the kind of media we're trying to tell now, and how can it travel and be really like regional and local. So I'd bring back the Interaction bus as well.
Bring a bus. That's amazing. I love that. What about you, Dan?
Gosh, I'm really trying to think what I'd bring. I think like I was my first thought, because you sprung this one on us.
I know.
My first thought was I would bring a puppy there, you know.
Yes,
And I
yes.
don't really know why I thought that. I just really like dogs, and we've got two puppies, and they're quite big now. But like, I think that's quite a nice thing to bring anywhere, really, because they're so friendly and lovely. And I think we're all going around kind of feeling that things are so broken, you know. So I was thinking, well, what could I do that would make people feel a little bit better without just saying something glib, you know? And maybe that is a puppy. I was also thinking, the other thought I had was a telescope, you know, to look out the window and remind ourselves that we are like on a tiny star amid like a huge, you know, galaxy of things, just to try and remind ourselves about the kind of complete and utter chaos and wonder of the universe. You know, I think we get sucked into thinking about like all the problems and all the terrible things, and you know, and what we can do about those. And we all, you know, we all ingest like so much worry, you know. And I think that there's something about like looking at the universe that can a little bit kind of, you can think, well, you know, I can let go of some of this. Like, you know, this is a vast amount of stuff in this universe and I can't control it, you know. And I think that or I can only control a very, very tiny amount of stuff. Maybe there's something there. I think we need to somehow find a way of feeling better amongst all of this stuff. And, you know, and I think that maybe the telescope is part of that.
As part
And
of
the
a
puppy
mindfulness
as well.
practice.
Yeah, maybe a puppy plus a telescope.
Amazing. And what about yourself, Debs?
I really like what you're saying, Leonie, about the Interaction bus. Let's definitely talk about that more. And I think that relationship between food and storytelling is so instinctive. I was reading something in the Big Issue recently about a mobile greengrocers that just like goes to council estates, and the idea is you can just come on and like if you've got 50p, you can just like, you know, you can always get an apple and 2 carrots or whatever. And I love the idea if you combine those things, you're like, okay, we're just going to take the fresh fruit and veg, and then we're also going to have a way of like capturing stories and getting people to talk about what is going on and what's important to them right now. That could be a really sweet way of giving. And I also think there's, you know, you do really get this in the film, you're saying of how getting people in a kind of artistic headspace, or like coming to something with some creativity and some playfulness, and how it's like a way of lifting something out of the ordinary, and connecting, or even like you're saying with the puppy, you know, a puppy just like evokes something like when you spend time with a toddler, there's a sense of wonder. And yeah, that there's so much to like worry about. I really like you're saying, Dad, of like the puppy is like being the immediate, and the space of like remembering that you are a little animal in this place, and then the telescope, which is like, and look at the wonder that still is like beyond our comprehension. And everything that sits in the middle distance that is so bleak is then somehow put into perspective a little.
Couldn't agree more. That's really beautiful. Well, thank you guys for your contributions. This is the last question before I let you guys go. Sorry, this one's been a long one. What is the one thing everyone should do leading up to 2029? Whoever has an idea first gets to speak first.
What, like, can I just ask before I reply, like, what specifically about 2029 is it that
You know what? It's the one time I forgot to give the context. I'm so sorry. So in 2029, we may live in a Europe and UK that is run by authoritarians. You could say it already is. So in light of this, what is the one thing that everyone should do leading up to 2029?
Gosh, well, I've been reading an interesting pamphlet, like from George Orwell, that he wrote during the Second World War, all about authoritarianism and literature and how one should respond. And I think like authoritarianism kind of like demands complete and utter, belief in anything that it says at any moment, and it's always changing. I think that's one of the points that he makes. And I guess we just have to remind ourselves to be free in the way that we think and write, and not to take blocks of thoughts, which are easily digestible. So I think like creative risk taking is really, really important as a kind of like as a practice. Writing and sharing things that you feel, that you have to really push yourself to send because you feel like they're too personal or they're too revealing, of a truth, and I think we need to be able to say things that we don't think other people may approve of, because I think once it goes internally, the authoritarianism is conformity, isn't it? Ultimately, it's conformity to some form of external power. So I think the best antidote for it is to retain like your own freedom to think clearly and to share those thoughts.
Thank you, Dan. All right, Leonie.
Yeah, I think similarly, it's just like participating in contributing to funding each other's work and stories and things that are happening in the grassroots and bottom up, and sharing hopeful stories that we are doing and that are happening rather than going from the top down.
And Debs.
I didn't know you were going to call on me. I've not
Sorry.
thought.
Too bad.
I do think that, the thing that you're looking at in the film is around trying to meet some aspect of a basic material need in a collective and autonomous way, and actually being able to show that that's possible, especially in the context of like there's a kind of gradual decline that is happening, as in our kind of decline into authoritarianism and decline of, but there's also going to be these shocks, and there have been these shocks, and there will be shocks probably between now and 2029. And what does it mean if, there's another massive energy price surge, for there to be some people who can say we've been insulated from that because we did this thing together. And being able to kind of demonstrate that is possible, I think is one of the only things that will really counter the stories that are being told in the mainstream sense, which is all of these things that you feel out of control of in your life, and that you're subject to these massive forces. That's the fault of some immigrants, and that's the fault of disabled people, and that's the fault of these scroungers or whatever. To be able to really counter that and say that's not true, you also have to be able to show that some people who you might identify with and you can see are similar to you, it's not just about some rich people who have got some solar panels on their houses. Some people like you are able to live a bit better in these really chaotic circumstances, and that maybe that could be your future too.
And this is exactly why we do this podcast, right? Is because it's the desire to feature the work of incredible people who are doing things that many people don't even know about, but should know about. And above all, center around action, about doing, about talking and making, and in this instance, creating something really beautiful. So with that, I will say thank you so much for coming on, Dan, Leonie, and Debs. And yeah, I really wish you all the best with your work. Thank you for your time. And for any listeners, make sure you check out their work, Power Station, see if it is coming to a screening near you, and make sure to follow us at News Club UK _ on Instagram, because that's the only social media platform I can bring myself to look at. And with that, I will say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us. If they want to check us out, it's power.film is the connection.
Yeah, we'll be sharing all links on our social media. So that's it. All right, bye.
All right. Bye. Bye.